This lecture will introduce you to narrative genres and the usefulness of narrative genres and understanding those genres when you are trying to learn to become a better writer and composer. So let's start first with what a narrative genre is. So a narrative itself is just a spoken or written account of events and a story. It can be fiction or nonfiction, it can be funny or sad, it can be historical and even poetic. And when we're talking about narrative genres, we are talking about the different ways in which, in this class, we're talking about the different ways in which those narratives are constructed. So what we're going to be doing is breaking down how narrative genres are created and what different types of narrative genres there are in order to understand some of the conventions a little bit better. And we're going to do that by not only reading and learning about them, but also by creating our own narratives. So to start out, the first thing we want to consider is the rhetorical situation. And the first part of that is considering the purpose and the why. So why do we tell stories? Well, people have been telling stories throughout time, and it's a way to help us connect with each other as humans. And that is one of the reasons why we tell stories, to document our own lives and to also connect with people that are similar to us and even sometimes dissimilar from us. When we're thinking about the rhetorical situation of narrative genres, we also need to consider the audience, especially when we're creating our own genres, because how the choices that we make as a composer and an author is going to be directly affected by the audience, just like we saw in the previous lectures about genre in general. When you are trying to make decisions as a writer, you need to make those decisions based on your audience. And that's what writers do when they write fiction and nonfiction stories in order to connect with their reader. And when making those choices, one of the things you need to consider is the question, how do we get others to connect with our stories? Because your audience might not be your person. They might not have the same qualities and ethics or even background as you do, and so sometimes you have to think of strategies that can encompass more people into your audience than just one person. So just a little rhetorical refresher here. Remember that the rhetorical situation is the relationship between the author, the audience, and the text. Remember that rhetorical triangle from the Understanding Genres lecture? So we're looking at the audience, the author, and the text, and how those things connect, all held together by the context. And that's why it's really important when we're talking about all the different genres we'll be studying in this course that we consider the audience and the purpose and the different aspects of the rhetorical situation, because we're always looking for how those relationships interact. Once you understand how the relationship between the author, the audience, and the text works, it will make you a stronger writer and a stronger reader, because you can pick up on what tools writers use in your reading to create their purposes geared towards specific audiences, and that can help you understand the reading a little bit better. And as a writer, it can help you because you'll be able to identify your purpose more easily. Therefore, the choices you make will be better, and your audience will connect better to your own writings. And in this case, the writing is a narrative. So more on that rhetorical situation. Remember, the definition of rhetorical situation is the relationship between the author, the text, and the audience, all held together by the context. You can think of it as a triangle if it helps you see those intersections a little bit better. So one other thing that we need to discuss when we're talking about the rhetorical situation of narrative genres are the rhetorical appeals. We need to think about how we use ethos, logos, and pathos to tell stories. So let's take a look first at a little refresher. Just to refresh your mind, ethos is the strategy that an author uses to appeal to the audience's sense of authority. Pathos is the strategy that an author uses to appeal to the audience's sense of emotion, and logos is the strategy that an author uses to appeal to an audience's sense of logic. So let's take a look at ethos first, or authority. I think that a lot of times students can sometimes struggle with understanding how ethos or authority functions in a text, because when we think of authority, we sometimes think of right or wrong, and that's not necessarily what it is per se. It all actually really kind of depends on the audience's perception. You know, like we've talked about previously, if the audience thinks that they're credible or trustworthy, then they are going to believe that they have authority. And it also has to do with their expectation of the person as well. If you expect that someone like J.K. Rowling is going to write a book about magic, and then she comes out with a book about a murder, then when you read the book, you think about murder, you think it lacks credibility because she should be writing about all things magic, like Harry Potter. So that authority can work in fiction and in nonfiction. And it can be a little tricky sometimes thinking of ways in which authors establish authority. I just gave you that fictional example about J.K. Rowling, but if you think about nonfiction, in particular, when we talk about memoirs or literacy narratives, when you talk about nonfiction, one way that you can establish authority is by directly addressing your audience, and that lets them know, especially if you're talking about your own life or your own experience, that you're trustworthy because you're telling them about your own life, so they have no reason to distrust you. Another way that you can establish authority is by illustrating how others who are well-known authorities on a subject also align with your opinion or support your opinion. And when we talk about research, the one way that you do that is through using good, reliable sources. So in narratives, you can establish ethos based on who you are as an author. If you're going to write, for instance, if you talk about someone like, I don't know, if you're going to write a country song, but you've never lived in the country or even been to the country and you've grown up in New York all your life, you might have a hard time winning your audience over as a country singer because they might think that you have no authority there when you're writing those lyrics. So think of different ways in which authors and artists, musicians influence your understanding of authority, and whether you find them trustworthy or not in their fictional and non-fictional pieces. So the second appeal, pathos or emotion, is a little easier to understand when we talk about narrative genres, because I think it's the thing that gives, the flavor to the piece. Something's really funny, or something makes you cry, or something makes you proud to be an American. Those techniques that writers use fill the emotion, but that needs to fit the genre, right? If you're going to write something in a narrative genre that's funny, then it's going to need to, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. If you're going to put something that's in an emotional, you want to think of a way to make it connect. It's got to fit in with the audience that's reading the genre. For instance, if you're writing a love story, like The Notebook or something like that, and you want to get those tears flowing during the very emotional love scene, you need to consider what the audience of young women who would likely read that would be interested in order to establish that emotion. Ways to establish emotion in narratives really depends on your understanding of audience. What's funny to me might not be funny to you. And you have to think of the thing that your audience might find humorous or might find sad, and think of your audience first, and then figuring out how to create those moments in your piece of narrative, fiction or nonfiction, will really help you establish that emotion. And you can think of ways that people do this, Super Bowl commercials with comedy. They're thinking of their audience. Who is their captive audience for the Super Bowl? Yes, you could say, well, it's general American audience because so many people watch it, and they do have to kind of make it where they appeal to everyone, but it's really sports fans, people that watch sports. It is across genders and ages, but usually those commercials, for the most part, are geared towards men. As a matter of fact, I think last year or the year before, some of the commercials came across as really sensitive, and it was people kind of, the critique of the commercials that year was that they were overly emotional and that the advertisers didn't consider their audience, that they needed to have more upbeat, funny things. So you always, when you're thinking of how do I establish emotion, think of who your audience is and what would play on their emotion when you're thinking about creating narratives. So the last one is logos or logic. And when we're talking about logic, it's easy in a research paper or a car commercial to identify facts. They're the statistics. They're the things in the sources. But when you're talking about fiction or nonfiction, it can also have to do with the order, how things are ordered, the chronology of a piece. What time period does it take place in? How does that time period affect the setting? They're going forward through time, right? Different patterns that authors might use. And also reasoned arguments, too, can be a part of it, too, especially when you talk about looking for underlying meaning. There are a variety of different ways to establish logos in a narrative genre, and that could be, like I said before, giving clues about the setting to let people know what the time period is, having a good structure and organization where you're not all over the place telling your narrative. You're in a cohesive, reasoned pattern so that your audience doesn't get lost. And filling in the details can contribute to that logos. I need some facts. Especially say if you're telling me a personal story, I don't know you, so I need to know the facts about the people in your life that you're describing. Was your aunt a nice person or a mean person? Was she tall? Was she skinny? What did she look like? I need those facts in order to understand what it is you're describing in your narrative. So logos can help you in establishing those rhetorical appeals in your narratives. So another thing that we need to consider when we're talking about narrative genres are modes and media. And really, again, I'm going to say this until you're so sick of it, audience and purpose is key when you're figuring out which of these choices to make and picking your mode and your media. We often think of fiction as books, but that's changing today when we're talking about narratives, because fiction can be online, it can be in a film, it can be in a YouTube clip, and that's why it's important to understand your audience, because which media or mode that you pick to tell your story is going to depend on your audience and what would appeal to them mostly, and your purpose that you're trying to get across. The Bedford on page 45 has a good chart of different kinds of narrative genres. They talk about Frederick Douglass's memoir and an Aesop's fable, and they talk about the different modes and mediums that you can access those in, like written, print, or digital, or even audio and visual. And again, it's what you're going to pick is based on what kind of effect you're trying to get across in your purpose, depending on your audience. So let's talk about some conventions of narrative genres. And let's try to answer the question, what do all stories have in common? So we've talked about the fact that there can be different subgenres of narratives, like literacy narrative. If you look in our book has literacy narratives, graphic memoirs, written memoirs. I think they have a photo essay. They have a lot of subgenres of the narrative genre in there. But there are a few things that all of these subgenres have in common. Style. So when we're thinking about style, we're thinking about how it contributes to a story. You know, all narrative genres have some sort of style. They are different based on which subgenre of the narrative it is, and they're all influenced, like I say here, by the rhetorical situation. But they all have some sort of voice, they all have some sort of language, they all have details, and they all utilize different literary techniques, such as having dialogue or characters or a plot. Okay, even nonfiction pieces have some sort of plot or structure. So while the choices of how you style it might be different depending on the subgenre that you're using, all stories do have these things in common. It's the choices that make them different. Same with design. And again, audience and purpose. And it's the best format choices that you're using based upon that audience and purpose. But they do all have these things in common. Stories all have these things in common. Font choices or word choices if it's an oral tale, or photos or images if it's visual. You know, for instance, if you're telling a story that's a traditional written essay for a class, you're going to need MLA conventions. They're going to be design choices that you have to make when you create a narrative. So all stories have some sort of design. Even if it's someone standing up and just telling you a story and using their hands to gesticulate the story, they're still giving you that format, and they've made those choices in the design of how they delivered that story to you to get their purpose across to you as their audience. And then sources. So fiction and nonfiction pieces have sources. They might not be what you think of as sources like for, say, a research assignment, but authors do draw on sources, and they don't necessarily mean database assignments or, you know, newspaper articles, though they could be. You know, fictional writers might use personal experience, or they might research a town that they're setting their story in so that they know little details like what kind of trees grow in that area to describe when they're giving the scenery. Or it could just be their general knowledge. But there are going to be some sorts of sources that you rely on for narrative genres. And it could be the knowledge of others. Even though, like I said, it might not be a dictionary definition as a source that you rely on, but it could be sources that are personal in nature. And all stories have some sort of source material, whether it's an oral story told through time that's been rewritten, or it's a personal experience. So those are some tips and tricks for understanding narrative genres and understanding the rhetorical situation of narrative genres and some of the conventions of narrative genres in general. I hope that you will find this helpful as you continue to study to become a better reader and writer in this class.